All right. So today we're going to be talking a bit about front-end development, which by that I mean the programming that allows you to actually see the internet. So, we've got the Code Platoon, this calendar right here, everything you're seeing on the Code Platoon webpage. This is all front-end development. And front-end development typically consists of three major parts: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we're going to be talking about two of those today, HTML and CSS. Who here has worked with HTML before?
I have.
Mm-hmm. Great. So does anyone know what how did you find HTML is compared to something like Python or JavaScript?
HTML is boring looking.
I'm sorry, what
It's
did you
not
say?
fun. It's boring. It feels very like standardized, and there's it's a lot less creative. It feels very
That's an objective statement. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, HTML is very, very different. It's not really programming as we think of it right now, because it's not about logic. You don't create algorithms or anything like that. HTML operates more like building blocks. You have a bunch of pieces you can create and customize. You can stack them all together and create something. So for some people, they find this very, very fulfilling. Other people don't like it so much, and that's okay. But it is something that, as a developer, you are definitely going to be working with. Maybe not in your day-to-day job if you end up in a back-end development thing, but a basic knowledge of HTML and CSS is pretty much assumed for most developer jobs out there right now. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And what it is, it's really a set of instructions that tells your browser how to display a web page. And it's typically made of what we call elements. And elements define what type of content you are showing, and then the content itself is what's actually appearing on the page. So some of the challenges of HTML, besides the fact that it's not really programming, is it requires a lot of memorization. Just certain tags are going to behave a certain way, and you got to remember that. You can always look it up, just like with everything in programming. But for some people that may be difficult, for some other people that might be easy. And you always have to be aware that different types of browsers will interact with your HTML code in different ways. Any questions on what HTML is before we actually try using it? All right. So I'm going to make a new HTML file. I'm going to call this index.html. And I'm going to do the first thing you should always do whenever you're making a new, learning a new coding language for this time. I'm going to make my hello world statement. To do that, I'm going to write this. So I typed in these kind of carets and then H1, and VS Code actually auto-completed to have this second H1 tag with the backslash there. So these are called tags. And tags are almost always have an opening and a closing, like so. So opening tag, closing tag. There are some exceptions to this rule, and we'll be seeing some of those today. And inside of your tags, you have the content. So in this case, I have my content is hello world, and it's in between these H1 tags. And the H1 tags are going to tell my browser how to render this content. So I'm going to open this up. You can also get an extension to open up your HTML in VS Code. I prefer to open it in a browser just because it's more similar to what you'll actually see when you run it in a browser. And as you can see here, I just typed in hello world, but we've got this thing right here. It's much bigger and bolder than you would think, right? So H1 is one of the more common ones. It stands for heading or header one, and it's for making headers. So you can create that, and you can, I believe you can create H2, H3, H4, down to 6 or 7, I believe. And those are just smaller versions of this. And so whenever I want to change what's actually displayed on my page, I can just change the content by changing it to content, refresh this. Now this is here. And if I want to change how it's displayed, I change my tags. And so now I've got this pretty thing.
No, I'm sorry. I must have turned away for a second. How did you get Chrome to go to search to that file?
So what I did is I just typed in open index.html into my command line, and that automatically, and when you do that, it'll automatically open the HTML file in your browser.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
No problem. So this is the general pattern of HTML. Select a tag, put the content in, and see how it interacts with everything else on your page. So it's all about the combination. All right, any questions about how this very basic HTML thing works? I'm going to put this back to the way it was just because I like that better. So one thing you also hear is that elements sometimes have children. So you'll often hear like parents and children whenever we're talking about HTML and front-end development. And what we mean is sometimes inside one set of tags, you can have content inside another set of tags. So I'm going to set up another one. So I'm creating a div element. Div is short for divider, and it's just essentially a box that you can put content into. So it doesn't look like anything on its own. It's there to separate elements from each other. And now I'm going to give this div box a child. I'll do an H2 element this time. And I'll call this one subheading. Now if I go back to my browser and refresh the page, there it is. So the div doesn't look like anything, but now it has a child in this H2 tag. All right, so another thing to keep in mind is that elements in HTML have many properties that you can change and edit, and we'll talk a bit more. But one thing you do need to understand if you're going to build things without too much confusion is how an element is displayed. So a tag like H1 is what we call a block element. And a block element takes up the entire width of the browser window. So you notice the actual text doesn't do that, but the actual H1 tag essentially is covering all of this because it's a block element. A different one is, for example, a link. So that's the A tag. A stands for link. So I'm just going to say this is a link that at the moment doesn't actually go anywhere because I didn't give it an URL to visit. A link is an inline element, meaning it only takes up the space of its contents.
No, does that mean the H1 by default is like left justified or something?
Yes, you're right. So
Okay.
by default, all of these are left justified. This is something you can actually change, and we'll talk about that a little more when we learn about CSS. But as you can see, HTML without any styling just looks like this. Text stacked on text, stacked on text. Not much interesting going on. So what I'd like you to do next is I'm going to paste a link in the Slack channel. that'll show you some of the tags and what they do. And then what I would like you to do is visit your favorite website, doesn't matter what. And when you visit your website, right-click somewhere. And when you do, there should be a menu that pops up, and you can click on the word inspect. And when you do that, that'll actually display all of the HTML on the page, which is pretty cool. And while you're doing that, so you can actually take a look and see how your favorite websites are built. And you can even actually edit them. Let me find like a good example. So if I inspect, you can actually inspect a specific element. So I can see that this right here is an H1 tag. And I can actually see all of the text that's in it. So I could say, change this around to, and it changes on the page temporarily. You won't actually change the website itself, just for until you refresh the page. So I'd like you to take the next 5 minutes, so until 10:16, to just inspect a page, see how it's built, and take a look at some of the tags and what they do. You can also change tags as well. You can just edit the HTML anywhere you want. And just really mess up a website. Don't be afraid to just have fun with it. An easy one to mess around with is Wikipedia, actually, because it's got a fairly simple layout that you can mess around with and have fun with as well.
No, like I'm looking at Wikipedia, and I like in the elements part, it's I can see lots of sort of divs and classes and things like that. But where's the actual the content itself isn't obvious.
Yeah, sometimes you can see that everything's kind of in a drop-down menu. So if you click here, it'll show you everything inside of that. And so you can find like, all right, I'm in Wikipedia, here's a div. I look inside the div, there's the link, and there's something here called small. If I click on this, I can find, okay, here's where it says articles.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's a lot of turtles.
And how do you do the editing? So I'm just trying to mess with one of them, but I couldn't do what you're doing where you're changing something on the fly like that.
Yeah, so you can, if you just double click on something, it should open up a little text thing. So you can just say, change what type it is, change stuff like this, everything like that. So you can just double click is essentially how you would open up the text editor part. And I will say this works best in Chrome. I don't know if you're using something like, I know Safari has an editor and so does Firefox, but I haven't tried every browser, so they're not all built equal. But most browsers will have this option, which is what we call developer tools. And we're going to be spending a lot of time in developer tools the more further we get into front-end development.
So if you type it into the HTML side, right? How do you get it so it loads up with your changes? Do you just refresh it, or does it save that?
Yeah,
Just
so in your
for-
own
just for that
HTML
local
file, once you've saved the file, you can just refresh in your browser and it'll reflect those changes that you've made.
Gotcha.
All right, so let's come back to talk a little bit more about that. So I'm just curious, like how many people there, like you probably saw some things on whatever website you're on that you didn't recognize, right? HTML has a ton of elements. It's hard to really keep track of all of them. You'll find over time that you'll have some that work the best for you, and other times you'll find that there are some you'll need to find something for a very specific purpose. So a lot of learning HTML comes down to experimentation.
Yeah, and you're not expected to memorize all of them.
Yeah, for sure. But you probably saw that, okay, Wikipedia here doesn't look anything like what I have here. And the major difference there, besides what's actually on it, is styling. And we style our page via something called CSS. Has anyone ever know what CSS stands for?
Cascading style sheets.
Exactly. So cascading style sheets, when the cascading part means that the last line of code to run is what's rendered by the browser. It's like from top to bottom. So HTML and CSS work together. You can have HTML without CSS. CSS without HTML doesn't really do much. But the best metaphor for understanding the relationship between these two is to think about buildings and how they're built. You can think of HTML as the frame of the building. So, you know, the walls, the floor plan, everything like that. That's the architecture, the HTML. CSS is the style of the building. So what color paint it is, where you put the windows, what color carpet you want, decorations, everything like that, that's CSS. So HTML is the content, CSS is the style of the content, which turns this into this. And there are many ways to to add CSS to your code. I'm going to go over some of the most basic ones. So I'm actually going to comment all of this out. Okay, can't do that all because of the way HTML comments work. So first I'm going to set up what's called I'm just going to put one element in here for now. I'm going to use the P tag, stands for paragraph. And so it's just what a paragraph is just a block of text that has a new line built into it. So it's always one line below whatever's above it. So if I refresh my browser, that's all I've got. And if I want to make it look nicer, I can add some style right inside here, inside the brackets of the opening tag of the element. So I would write style equals, and then I would say what kind of color I want, what I want to do. So I could say color is red, and then I'd add a semicolon. The colon and the semicolon, this format is more or less the basics of CSS. It's what you want to change and what you want to change it to. And VS Code is offering has some very helpful tools when it comes to coloring. So I can actually like pick out a very specific color if I want it to, but let's stick with, well, it's changed it to the RGB color. So CSS has some color names it knows automatically, and sometimes you can insert just the RGB color of the hex code. Either way, if I look at my browser, let's change the color of the element. That's one way of doing it. One thing I can also do, so CSS, cascading style sheets, is I can create a style sheet. To do that, first thing I need to do is I need to set up what's kind of the basic framework of an HTML page. So typically everything is contained inside an HTML tag. And then inside the HTML tag, you'll have two other tags. You'll have the head and you'll have the body. So the body is typically where you put your content, and the head is where you put other information your page needs. So I'm going to put that p tag back into my browser's body, sorry, my page's body. And nothing will actually look any different. It still looks the same. But having this HTML setup is very, very useful. And you can, I believe exclamation point tab will kind of set it up even more, set it up even better for you. At least if you have the right browser extension installed. It's not browser extension, VS Code extension. So to set up my internal style sheet is what this is. I'm going to put this in the head. I'm going to put a tag called style. Inside of the style sheet, I need to say two things. First, I need to say, all right, I need a selector saying which elements I want to style. In this case, I want to style a p tag. And then I'm going to have some brackets. And then I'm going to say, all right, what do we actually want to style for our Ps? I'm going to say color is red. So again, so we have our selector saying get the p tag, everything inside a p tag, and change the color to red. And does the same thing. And there's one other way to do that, and this is the way that most people do, is we can also link to an external style sheet. So I'm going to make a new file, and I'll call this one stylesheet.css. And to link it there, instead of having this style sheet inside my head, instead I'm going to use a link tag. And it already automatically knows I'm trying to link a style sheet. And it's going to ask me for the href, which in this case is, OK, what file am I linking to? And I'm linking to stylesheet.css. So this right here says, all right, I want to include the styles from whatever is in this CSS file and apply them to this particular HTML doc. And then once I'm there, the syntax is almost the same as the internal style sheet. I would say what I want to select, in this case a p tag, brackets. And you can put this on multi-lines if you want. Like I think it looks nicer. I'm going to say the color is red. And nothing changed because this works exactly the same way as the internal style sheet. But I like using the external style sheet because it allows my HTML to only contain the actual content, and then I can leave all the styling in a separate place that I can refer to. What questions do you have about styling so far?
So when you're doing the ref, there's a relative path, right? That's showing that it's in the same folder, basically.
Generally speaking, yes, you'll be using a relative path. And since my style sheet is in the same folder as my index, then I can just say the name. If it was in a different folder, I would have to use something like, //css/style sheet, something like that. So as we make more complex programs and more complex websites, you may find yourself doing that. And one thing you can do, and you will end up doing at some point, is you can actually also link to CSS style sheets that come from external sources. One thing we'll be talking about later on is, for example, an external library called Bootstrap. And you can get Bootstrap just by essentially saying, I'm linking to this external thing using a URL.
No, I have kind of a broad question. Like I've watched some like developers on YouTube style pages and stuff like that, and they were kind of doing like what you were doing, where they were like modifying the CSS and then jumping to the browser to see how that looked and all that stuff.
Yep.
Is there not a way, like an interactive way, like for example, like when I work on PowerPoints, I could highlight a text, change the color and all that stuff rather than modifying code? It seems a little strange to not
You
be
mean-
doing it interactive.
As in like doing it directly in essentially if I could do this right here in the browser.
Right. Or some kind of visual thing where you're like, okay, make it italics or make it some different font size or whatever.
Like
I'm
a live view or a hot reload, you know?
I'm sorry? I didn't
Like
catch that.
live view or a hot reload.
Mhm.
Node should do that, right?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I can't remember exactly. But I imagine there are probably tools like that that can help you do this, do this with a more visual interface. But in general, it's important to know how to do this just by hand, because many
So
shops
this
will
is
do
the
that.
standard way to do it?
This is the standard way, I would say. Yeah,
Okay, thanks.
no problem.
Yeah. I just echo that, having done a decent amount of this, they have these WYSIWYG editors, but you really end up chasing your tail. And as soon as you want to get outside the box, you got to go do this stuff anyway. So it's easier to do.
So
Like WordPress, you can use, and then you can do WYSIWYG stuff where you just highlight it. Like, I think you'd have to use some kind of interface like that.
Yeah, they're developing programs like that right now. That's essentially what Squarespace and some of the other web development things are. They allow you to visually develop your own website so you don't have to learn to write code. But the point of being able to write code is to be able to develop a different website than what Squarespace or some other programs that are that visual can do.
Yep.
Back to Jason's initial thing. I know what he's talking about. Back in the day, you used to use either Microsoft Front Page or Adobe Dreamweaver, which it would build the pages out for you. Today there's like Squarespace and stuff, so you don't have to do that. But it was basically a software application you'd run, and you could like type into the screen. It would generate the HTML and the CSS for you, but it was frowned upon from actual developers because it was like you weren't learning how to actually modify HTML and CSS. You were just using a tool that did all of the work for you, and it wasn't really clean in any way.
Yeah.
But there is that.
And to my mind, there's nothing that can really substitute the flexibility you get once you've really mastered CSS and HTML. And you can see some amazing stuff that people do with just vanilla CSS and HTML. If you ever want inspiration, there's a CodePen.io. There's a front-end development kind of social media almost. And you can see like things people make. And so let's find like something like, let's see what this is. I imagine this is just HTML. This is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Someone made this. And like you can see, we can see all the code of how they did it. So all the HTML, CSS. So if you ever want inspiration for like what's possible with just using the code, I mean, look. So I would like to just have like one more example of, how CSS works, just to kind of hammer it in. So I'm going to make another tag. I'm going to make this one in H5. So heading 5, let's call it text. And so the syntax is always selector. So the selector in this case is I want to select in H5. And then inside the brackets, we put our styles. So we're changing a property to a value. So first off, I guess I'm just going to refresh. There's the text. If I want this to be centered, for example, the property I want to change would be text align. And the value I want to change it to would be center. And there it is. Now it's in the center of the page. So again, I'm going to ask you to do something similar to what we did with the HTML. I'm going to put a link in the chat to kind of show you a lot of the properties you can change in CSS. Find a website, and this time when you inspect it, if you go to sources, I believe. All right, maybe this isn't a good example. Let me try the Code Platoon website again. Maybe if I go back to elements. Here we go. If you look here, there's something called styles which essentially is a CSS sheet. And so you can change things however you want. So, all right, I've got something here that says font size to 20 pixels. I could change it to 100 pixels. And all right, looks like that looks like it was robust enough to not do that. Sometimes things interact with each other in weird ways. So you got to just kind of mess around with it some more. But like I can change the color of the live chat box down there. So again, take a look at that link. Then try messing with the CSS of a website using the styles tab down at the bottom of the elements. And you can just change things there and try things out. So again, take the next 5 minutes for that. So till 10:36. All right. So this is cool and all, but sometimes you want to be a little more specific with how you change things, right? Let's say I've got two divs. And I want, say, I'll have one have some like, some text, some more text, or let's call this some bigger text. So I want to change these so that this one is bigger than this one, but they're both divs. So if I go to my style sheet and say, div change to be font size 32px or 23px, I guess now, I change both of them when I only want to change one. So does anyone know a way I could make it so that I only change one div instead of both of them?
Inline styling?
I could use inline styling. So I could only put that here. And that would work if I just have one, but maybe I have a bunch of divs that all have some bigger text, but not all of them. Then I need a way to affect multiple ones. And
I think you could assign a class or something like that. Or
yes, we can assign what's called a class. And if you take a look at the HTML here, a lot of these elements, in fact, almost all of them have something called a class. So this thing right here has the class of AV special heading tag. And a class is essentially an additional selector you can put onto your elements so that you can be more specific about what you are changing and when. And to do that, I would just say class equals bigger div. And then to go here, I would say, okay, instead of changing that, I would need to enter my class name. I can't just write it in because what's going to happen here is it's going to look for a tag called bigger div, which doesn't exist. So whenever you want to enter a class name, you say dot and then the name of the class. So dot bigger div, font size 32px. So now I've only changed that one. And it'll also change any other element I give with this that has this class name. So anything with the class name bigger div will be changed the same way that this is. Another thing you can add, if you don't want to use a class, is something called an ID. And an ID works almost the same as a class. The difference is that a class, you can have multiple elements that all belong to the same class, but you typically only have one element on your page that has an ID. And when you ever want to enter a selector with an ID, use the pound sign. Like so. But this is where things get interesting because I'm going to add one thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add one thing to just affect divs. Let's make it like even smaller, just for fun. So this text got tiny. These texts didn't get changed, but they're still divs, right? So any theories on why just the div without a class or an ID got changed and these ones didn't?
The more specific your selector is, that's the one it uses.
Essentially, yes. And more specifically, every selector has a weight. So a plain select HTML tag, oh, okay, don't do that, has a weight of, I'll just put like, has a weight of 0.001. A class has a weight of 0.010. Don't really know how this is going to look on the page. And an ID has a weight of 0.100. So IDs will take preference over classes, and classes will take preference over just regular HTML tags. And one thing you can do is you can give a div multiple classes. So I could give class equals bigger div space and also red text. I'm just gonna do that. And essentially these two class selectors actually get combined. So this styling right here, this class equals with two different names, would actually have a weight of 0.02 rather than 0.010. So if you ever want to make sure, like, hey, this thing definitely want this to take precedence over other classes, you can actually combine classes, but you would need a lot of classes to override a single ID. So don't do that.
No, if there was a color in bigger div, what color does it turn out to be then?
So if I do that here, you mean in my biggest div selector, or in bigger div?
In the bigger div class, yeah.
Let's find out. So actually, we can inspect this, and we might be able to get a better thing of what happens here. So we can actually see that here's the class bigger div, and color green got overridden by red text. The question is why? And I have a theory. I'm actually going to try this. I'm just going to put it there. And now red text got overridden. So if you have two different classes with conflicting style, the last one will get precedence because they're cascading style sheets. They're read from top to bottom. So the last one to get read will take precedence and is the one that actually gets implemented. So in general, I would say whenever possible, try not to have conflicting styles because otherwise you may run into issues. But that's one thing to keep in mind. And you can actually see here, this one also overrode the div. We can see that, just got rid of it. All right, what other questions do you have about classes and IDs?
And no, on the like when I've used IDs before, like I've always kind of mentally, and this sounds like it was wrong, is like ID in general is like trying to is used to describe a unique thing, but it seems like in this context you can have div ID equals whatever 10 times, and that's not a problem.
No, we can try that. If I just say, just have another one of these down here, let's see what happens. So yeah, in this case, you can actually have multiple things with the same ID. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, but convention would state that you only have one element with an ID. That's what its kind of express purpose is, but it doesn't have any way of stopping us from using it this way.
Okay.
So this is more of a way of telling other developers, hey, if I gave this thing an ID, it's unique and its styling is very important. As opposed to a class, which is if you want something repeated, you should use a class. But again, nothing's stopping you from using an ID.
Thanks.
No problem. All right. So next thing I'm going to talk about is you may have noticed in your console, you've seen this. And this exists because everything on the internet is actually a box. So if I, inspect this element right here, I've got a box. It's all really just a box. And I can actually like highlight things here, and it'll highlight each box. So the body is a box, this p tag is a box, the h5 is a box, this div is a box. All of these are all boxes. And what we're seeing here is what's called the box model. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a specific box. So I'm going to call this one, I'll make another div. And I'm going to give this an ID of box. I'm going to put some stuff. And I'm going to use CSS to kind of highlight the box model. So the box model consists of 3 parts. Well, 4 really. In the middle, you have the content. And then you have padding. And padding represents the space between the content and the edge of your box. Outside the padding, you have the border. So that is the edge of your box. And then outside the border, you have the margin. And the margin represents how much space is between this box and other things in your other content on your page. So
No, sorry. Can you go through that one more time,
yeah, no problem.
please?
So here we have the content, text. So that's the content. And then we have the padding. And the padding represents the space in between the content and the outside of your box. And the outside of your box, the edges of your box, are represented by the border. Maybe it would make more sense if let's see, would the div show that better? No? Okay, that's fine. So the border represents the edges of the box. And then
Is
the
border
margin,
like infinitely thin? Does it have thickness?
by default, no, but we can change that.
Okay.
And then the margin represents how much space is between this particular element and other elements. And so I'm going to try to create this box div to kind of show you, kind of illustrate it more clearly. So you said I could make give the border thickness. I can. So I can give it a border property. And I can say, all right, I want the border to be 6 pixels thick. I want it to be solid, and I want it to be green. I also want to change what size the box is, and I can do that by changing the height. So I can say height is 200 pixels. So let's see how this looks right now, just as is. So I'm going to get rid of my inspector real quick. So here's the border. And I changed the height so that it exists up here. If I didn't do that, it would just be an infinitesimally thin line. And as you can see, a div by default actually spans the entire page. That's its default width. Now I want to change, all right, how much, actually, first off, I'm going to get rid of this so I don't have tiny, tiny font size in there. And my content is by default here in the left-hand corner. So now I want to change, all right, how far away this text is from the border. To do that, I'm going to change the padding. So I'm going to give this thing a padding of 20 pixels. When I do that, you can see it essentially said, all right, I want to make sure there's 20 pixels of difference to the left, at least 20 pixels of difference of distance between this and the borders. So 20 pixels here, 20 pixels there. And my box actually kind of shifted size a bit to make up for that. Next, I'm going to change the margin. I want to let more space in between this div and everything else. So I'm going to say margin is 30 pixels. So you can see it got pushed away from this and also from the sides of the page. So 30 pixels of margin said, all right, get me 30 pixels away from everything, including the edges of the page. And finally, if I don't want this div to take up the entire width of the screen or as much of it as it can do, I can give it a specific width as well, like 200 pixels. There we go. I've created a box. So again, here we have our margin. Let's see if I can show the inspector and see if I can get a better look at it now. So now I can see, like, okay, here's my margin. At least 30 pixels distance between this and everything else. Here's my border, which is 6 pixels thick and green. Here's my padding. That shows how much distance minimum we get between the content and the actual border. And then here's the content itself, which includes both this text and all the space that is not the padding or border or margin.
Hey, it looks like even though you reduce the width, it's still taking up the whole thing, right? When you highlight margin, it's highlighting the entire width.
Good point. So the margin is actually essentially just showing us how much distance is between this and everything else. There is a way I could put something here. This would require a little more styling. And then the margin would just be between this and whatever's to the right of it. Essentially, I don't know, let's try this out. I can change, so display is by default block in this case. I could change it to inline. Let's see what happens. So when I change to inline, it starts behaving very differently. It's now on the same line as this, and it's starting to overlap with that. Essentially, I'm making this div act in ways it's not really supposed to. And honestly, I'm like, and this is where we sometimes find that the difficulty of working with CSS is sometimes you change something and things change in ways you did not intend them to change at all. It's like changing something to display inline makes things work very differently than when it's display block. Like I'll say display inline block. There we go. So inline block kind of gives it a difference between inline and block. So it's on the same line as weight 100 here. But if we look at the margin now, the margin only extends to the thing to the left of it and over there to the right. So essentially, yeah, the margin changes depending on whether you're in display block, inline, or inline block. But by default, a div will always kind of, yeah, it'll even if the content itself is squished down, it will kind of cover the whole page unless you tell it not to. Right. What other questions do you have about this? So we'll get into, so over this weekend, after you either after you finish the challenge or at least, if you want to break from the challenge, we have some front-end challenges to do that'll kind of help you learn new ways of interacting with HTML and CSS. Eventually, we will expect, you'll be making entire web pages and eventually entire web applications using, in no small part, HTML and CSS. So on that, let's take a 6-minute break. So be back here at 11, and we'll go over assessment 3.